In the heart of Central America lies a land shaped by fire and water, Nicaragua. A narrow strip between the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean, where volcanoes breathe smoke into the sky and lakes stretch like mirrors of molten glass. The soil is rich, the people strong, and the spirit of the land ancient. But beneath the beauty, a shadow has long lingered. For decades, this nation lived under a single name, Somoza. The Somoza family ruled Nicaragua as if it were their own estate. They came to power in 1936, supported by the United States, promising order and stability after years of unrest. Yet what followed was not peace, it was silence, born of fear. The Somozas built a dynasty that lasted for more than 40 years. Father, then son, then another son, each held the reins of power, guarded by soldiers, wealth, and foreign support. The government was theirs, the army was theirs, even the newspapers spoke only what they allowed. To the world, the Somozas appeared strong allies in the fight against communism, a friendly regime that kept Nicaragua safe for democracy. But for the Nicaraguan people, life told another story. The rich lived in walled estates, their cars polished and guarded, their voices echoing in marble halls. The poor tilled the land from sunrise to sunset, often barefoot, earning barely enough to survive. In the cities, children begged on dusty streets, while foreign businessmen feasted in grand hotels. And in the countryside, peasants looked to the horizon and whispered, "Someday, things must change." The Somozas owned half the country, the farms, the factories, the banks, and even the port where goods arrived and left. Those who opposed them were silenced, sometimes with money, sometimes with bullets. The National Guard, their private army, patrolled the land like wolves in uniforms. Torture chambers existed behind thick walls, hidden but known to all. Yet even under fear, hope never truly dies. In the hearts of students, priests, workers, and farmers, a quiet anger began to grow, like the trembling of the earth before a volcano erupts. They began to ask simple questions. Why do so few have so much, while so many have so little? Why must our voices remain unheard? Why must we live as strangers in our own homeland? But in Somoza's Nicaragua, even questions could be dangerous. Teachers were watched, preachers were followed, journalists disappeared. Still, resistance grew, in whispers, in poems, in prayers. In the churches, priests began to speak of justice, quoting words from the Bible not just about heaven, but about equality here on earth. In the schools, young people read about revolutions in other lands and dreamed of one day writing their own. And in the mountains, small groups began to train, quietly, patiently. They would one day call themselves the Sandinistas, in honor of a hero from the past. To understand the fire that would soon consume Nicaragua, we must look further back, to the man whose name inspired the revolution. His name was Augusto Cesar Sandino. In the 1920s, when the U.S. Marines occupied Nicaragua, Sandino led a rebellion against them. He was a symbol of dignity, a man of the people, who believed that no foreign power should ever decide the fate of his land. Though he was killed in 1934, betrayed and executed, his spirit lived on. Decades later, young revolutionaries would take up his name, calling themselves the Sandinista National Liberation Front, or FSLN. At first, they were few: students, poets, and farmers with old rifles and fierce hearts. They met in secret, hiding from the National Guard, reading Marx and Marti under candlelight. They dreamed of justice, of education for all, of land for those who worked it. They dreamed of a Nicaragua where a child's worth was not decided by their father's wealth. But dreams alone could not move mountains, and the Somoza regime was a mountain made of money, guns, and fear. Every uprising was crushed, every rebel hunted. Still the dream survived. Then came the year 1972. On a quiet December night, the earth itself shook. A massive earthquake struck Managua, the capital. Buildings crumbled like paper. Fires burned through the night. Tens of thousands died or lost their homes. For a brief moment, it seemed the tragedy might unite the country, a chance to rebuild together. The world sent millions in aid to help the victims. But Somoza saw an opportunity, not a tragedy. The money vanished into the pockets of his family and friends. The poor received nothing but empty promises. This was the breaking point. Even those who had once supported the regime began to turn away. Businessmen, priests, students, all began to whisper that enough was enough. The world began to see what the Nicaraguan people had known all along. Behind Somoza's smile was a tyrant's heart. In the barrios and the mountains, the Sandinistas grew in strength and number. They trained in secret camps, shared food, taught reading and writing, and prepared for the day when silence would end. They spoke not of revenge, but of dignity, not of hate, but of freedom. By the mid-1970s, the volcano beneath Nicaragua's soil was stirring once more, and this time, when it erupted, no wall, no bullet, and no dictator would be able to stop it. For history has shown, when a people lose everything but their fear, they have nothing left to lose. And when they rise together, even the strongest tyrant can tremble. The wind over Managua carried a whisper that would soon become a roar. The time of the Somozas is ending. The 1970s dawned over Nicaragua with the illusion of calm. The sun still rose over Lake Managua, buses still rattled through the capital, and soldiers still patrolled the streets. But beneath that quiet rhythm of life, something was changing. Something ancient, like the stirring of a buried heartbeat. The Somoza regime still ruled with an iron hand. Anastasio Somoza Debayle, the third in the dynasty, sat atop his empire of wealth and fear. He wore tailored suits and smiled before cameras, calling himself a man of progress. But his wealth was built on the bones of his people. Factories were owned by his relatives. Government contracts went to his friends. The National Guard, the feared Guardia Nacional, acted not as protectors, but as enforcers of his will. Those who protested were beaten, jailed, or vanished into the night. But even walls of terror cannot contain an idea once it finds its voice. And in Nicaragua, that voice was beginning to rise. The Sandinista National Liberation Front, or FSLN, had begun to move from myth to movement. What had once been small groups of dreamers and rebels hiding in the jungles now became a network: students, peasants, priests, and workers, bound by a shared vision. Their belief was simple yet radical, that power should belong not to one man or one family, but to the people. By 1974, whispers of rebellion began to echo through university corridors and mountain trails alike. Meetings were held in candlelit rooms, coded messages passed in folded newspapers, and rifles smuggled in the backs of trucks marked farm supplies. But still the Sandinistas were hunted. The National Guard raided villages, arrested students, and burned homes believed to harbor rebels. Entire communities lived in fear, not of war, but of the endless waiting before it. And yet the Sandinistas did not stop. Each death became a spark. Each loss became a reason to keep fighting. One of those sparks came from Carlos Fonseca, the intellectual architect of the revolution. A teacher, thinker, and fighter, Fonseca dedicated his life to awakening the poor. He once wrote, "The people are not asleep, they are waiting." He dreamed of a Nicaragua where no one was hungry and every voice mattered. In 1976, Fonseca was killed in combat by Somoza's forces. His body was buried in secrecy, but his name became a battle cry. The FSLN adopted his vision that the revolution was not for revenge, but for rebirth. The Sandinistas divided into small mobile units, guerrilla fronts, operating in the mountains of northern Nicaragua. They learned to move silently, to blend with the land, to strike quickly and disappear. But while their weapons were few, their message spread like wildfire. Priests began preaching not just about heaven, but about liberation. They called it liberation theology, the belief that God stood with the poor in their struggle for justice. In Managua, young Catholics joined protests with slogans that mixed faith and revolution. "Blessed are the poor, for they shall inherit the earth." By 1977, even those who once feared the word revolution began to whisper it with hope. The fire beneath the ashes was growing hotter, and soon the world would see its light. In 1978, Nicaragua's fragile calm shattered. The spark came not from the mountains, but from the heart of Managua itself. On January 10th, a respected journalist and outspoken critic of the regime, Pedro Joaquín Chamorro, was assassinated. He had dared to speak the truth in a land of silence, exposing Somoza's corruption and calling for democracy. When he died, the nation erupted. Tens of thousands poured into the streets carrying his picture and shouting, "Asesinos, murderers." The anger was no longer confined to rebels. It was mothers, shopkeepers, students, people who had never before raised their voices. Even the wealthy elite, once silent beneficiaries of Somoza's rule, began to turn against him. The funeral became a protest. The protest became a movement, and the movement became a revolution. Across the country, strikes broke out. Factories shut down. Workers refused to obey. Cities that once trembled before the National Guard now painted walls with the words "Sandino vive," meaning Sandino lives. Somoza responded as he always had, with violence. The Guard opened fire on demonstrators, killing men, women, and children. Whole neighborhoods were bombed from the air, but the blood that spilled did not drown the revolution. It fed it. In the mountains, the Sandinistas launched a new offensive. They captured towns, disarmed patrols, and distributed food to villagers. They were no longer seen as bandits or dreamers, they were heroes. For the first time, the people saw a real chance at change. By mid-1978, the war had come to the cities. In León, Masaya, Estelí, and Matagalpa, the sound of gunfire replaced the morning bells. Barricades rose in the streets, built from overturned cars, stones, and broken furniture. The people fought with whatever they had, rifles, machetes, or just courage. From the rooftops, Nicaraguan youth waved the red and black flag of the Sandinistas. Those colors, blood and mourning, became the symbol of a nation reborn in struggle. The world began to notice. News cameras captured burning streets, crying mothers, and the defiance of a people who refused to kneel. In the United States, some began to question their government's unwavering support for Somoza. How could America, the land of liberty, continue to arm a dictator shooting his own citizens? By 1979, the country was at a breaking point. The Somoza regime, once unshakable, was crumbling under its own weight. The National Guard was stretched thin, the people united. And in the shadows, the Sandinistas prepared for their final march. It was no longer a whisper. It was a roar that shook the mountains. The fire beneath the ashes had become a storm. In the first months of 1979, Nicaragua seemed caught between two worlds, the old and the new. On one side, the Somoza family clung desperately to power, surrounded by U.S. advisors and loyal guards. On the other, an entire generation of Nicaraguans, armed not just with weapons, but with conviction, moved closer to liberation. The Sandinista leadership, now united under a single command, coordinated uprisings across the country. They called it La Ofensiva Final, the final offensive. In the countryside, peasants sheltered fighters and provided food. In the cities, students organized protests and built barricades. Radio stations, once silent under censorship, began broadcasting rebel messages. Brothers and sisters, rise, the time has come. The air was electric with both fear and hope. Every night, gunfire echoed in the distance. Every dawn, new flags appeared on rooftops. The regime responded with tanks and planes, but even bombs could not crush the will of a united people. The Catholic Church, once divided, now openly condemned Somoza's brutality. Priests held mass for the dead in the streets, standing beside grieving families. Even foreign journalists risked their lives to report what was happening, a revolution not of ideology alone, but of humanity. By June 1979, Somoza's control had shrunk to the capital. His soldiers were exhausted, his allies fleeing, his enemies everywhere, and yet he refused to surrender. He ordered the bombing of entire neighborhoods, killing thousands in a last attempt to hold power. But history had already chosen its side. On July 17, 1979, Anastasio Somoza Debayle fled Nicaragua, escaping by plane under cover of night. 2 days later, the Sandinistas entered Managua to a thunderous welcome. Tens of thousands filled the streets, waving flags, singing, crying, and embracing strangers. They had waited decades for this day, and now it had come. The dictatorship was over. The volcano had erupted, and in its lava, a new nation was being born. Dawn broke over Managua on July 19, 1979. But this sunrise was unlike any other. For the first time in more than 40 years, the air smelled of freedom. Smoke still rose from the battles of the night before. Roads were littered with debris, burnt-out tanks, and abandoned helmets of the fleeing National Guard. But amid the destruction, cheers echoed through the city. The Sandinistas had entered Managua. They came not in polished uniforms, but in dusty fatigues, their faces marked by exhaustion, their eyes burning with triumph. Farmers, students, factory workers, priests, and poets, a people's army. Children ran beside the trucks shouting, "Viva Nicaragua Libre!" Women wept in the streets. Old men raised trembling hands in salute to the revolution they thought they'd never live to see. At the head of the column was Daniel Ortega, one of the FSLN commanders, quiet, calculating, and determined. Beside him were men and women who had spent years in exile or underground: Tomás Borge, Sergio Ramírez, Gioconda Belli, Edin Pastora, and many others. They were not a single ideology. They were a mosaic. Marxists, Christians, nationalists, idealists, united by one goal: to rebuild a free Nicaragua. When the Sandinistas entered Managua, the flags of the Somoza dynasty were torn down. The red and black banner of the FSLN rose in their place, a symbol of struggle and sacrifice. Crowds flooded the square. The chants grew louder: "Patria libre o morir," free homeland or death. That day became Nicaragua's second independence, not from a foreign empire, but from the dictatorship that had enslaved its own people. But beneath the celebrations lay the immense question: what comes after victory? The Sandinistas faced a nation in ruins. The war had killed over 50,000 Nicaraguans. Entire cities lay in rubble. Factories were destroyed. Electricity was scarce. The treasury empty. Hospitals lacked medicine. Schools had no teachers left. It wasn't just a government they had to rebuild. It was a country. And they had little time to rest. The world was watching. To some, the Sandinistas were heroes of liberation. To others, especially in Washington, they were dangerous communists in America's backyard. But for that one shining moment, none of it mattered. The people had reclaimed their destiny. For the first time in decades, the poor, the forgotten, and the silenced stood at the center of power. In a speech that echoed through the plaza, Daniel Ortega declared, "Today, Nicaragua is free. The dictatorship has fallen. The people are the owners of their future." Cheers drowned his voice. Tears rolled down faces painted with dust and hope. After years of fear, joy felt foreign, almost unbelievable. And yet, in the corners of Managua, there were those who watched quietly: former guardsmen, landowners, and business elites, realizing that their world had just ended. In the weeks after victory, the FSLN formed a provisional government, the Junta of National Reconstruction. It was a coalition: revolutionaries, moderates, even some former critics of Somoza. They promised pluralism, democracy, and justice. A revolution not of vengeance, but of renewal. The spirit of solidarity swept across the nation. Young volunteers, many of them teenagers, took part in the National Literacy Crusade. They carried books instead of rifles, walking to remote villages to teach reading and writing. Within a year, illiteracy dropped by more than half, an achievement hailed by UNESCO and admired worldwide. Health brigades traveled from town to town, vaccinating children, rebuilding hospitals, and fighting malnutrition. For the first time, peasants were given land reforms, redistributing the vast estates of the Somoza elite. Unions were legalized, schools reopened, and culture flourished. Nicaragua was alive with optimism, murals painted on every wall, poetry in every voice, songs of revolution echoing in the air. But beneath the celebration, cracks began to show. The revolution had been born in unity, but now unity was harder to keep. Some within the FSLN wanted a Marxist-Leninist system modeled on Cuba. Others pushed for a democratic, mixed economy. The church supported social justice, but grew uneasy with the rising influence of communist ideology. Then came the United States, no longer applauding, but alarmed. In Washington, officials saw the Sandinista victory as a threat, another domino falling towards Soviet influence. After losing Iran earlier that year, and with Cuba already in the Soviet camp, Nicaragua's revolution looked like another red flag in Central America. The Sandinistas, desperate to rebuild, accepted aid from wherever it came: Cuba, the USSR, even Libya. To the U.S., that was confirmation of their worst fears. The CIA began to act. Funds, weapons, and training quietly flowed to remnants of the Somoza National Guard who had fled to Honduras. They would soon become the Contras, a counter-revolutionary army. But in 1979, few in Nicaragua knew what was coming. For now, it was still the season of hope. Children went to school carrying FSLN notebooks. Mothers held photos of sons who had died for freedom, believing their sacrifice had built something eternal. As the first revolutionary parade marched through the capital that December, one banner summed up the feeling of the nation. "We have conquered yesterday. Now we will build tomorrow." But in the shadows of that celebration, a storm was already gathering. A war that would soon test every dream the Sandinistas had fought to achieve. The summer of 1979 had ended with fireworks, tears, and songs of freedom echoing through the Nicaraguan hills. The Somoza dynasty, the family that had ruled, robbed, and repressed the nation for more than 40 years, was gone. In the streets of Managua, murals bloomed overnight. They showed farmers with raised fists, women in uniform, children holding red and black flags that fluttered like flames in the tropical wind. For the first time in generations, Nicaragua belonged to its people. But revolutions rarely rest. While the Sandinistas were busy rebuilding, the shadows were already gathering again. In Washington, the fall of Somoza had struck like a warning bell. For decades, Nicaragua had been America's quiet ally, a small but loyal piece in the U.S. Cold War chessboard. The loss of Managua to Marxist revolutionaries felt to many in the White House and the Pentagon like a spreading infection. The year was 1980, and Ronald Reagan was preparing to enter the Oval Office. To him, the Sandinistas weren't freedom fighters, they were communists in disguise. Another Cuba rising on the U.S. doorstep. And so, quietly, a new operation began. In the jungles of Honduras and the remote northern mountains of Nicaragua, armed groups started to form. They were called the Contras, short for Contra Revolucionarios, the counter-revolutionaries. Some were remnants of Somoza's defeated National Guard, still bitter and hungry for revenge. Others were peasants and disillusioned ex-Sandinistas who felt betrayed by the new government's growing centralization and ideological rigidity. But their real strength came from elsewhere, from Washington. The CIA began funneling money, weapons, and training to these groups under a covert plan that would later be exposed as one of the most controversial U.S. operations of the Cold War. The message was simple. If the Sandinistas had brought revolution, the Contras would bring war. The 1980s in Nicaragua began not with peace, but with whispers. That whispers turned into explosions. Bridges were blown up in the night. Grain silos were torched. Villages loyal to the Sandinistas were attacked. The Contras operated like ghosts, hitting fast, disappearing faster. Officially, the United States denied involvement, but the evidence was everywhere. U.S.-made rifles in Contra hands, helicopters crossing borders, propaganda pamphlets written in perfect English and Spanish. Behind the scenes, the CIA orchestrated a campaign of sabotage meant to destabilize the young revolutionary government. The Sandinistas called it the Dirty War. It was not fought on battlefields, but in coffee farms, schools, and small villages. Teachers and nurses, symbols of the revolution's promise, became targets. Roads built by volunteers were destroyed. Health centers burned. For a country that had only just begun to heal, the wounds reopened, deeper than before. In Managua, the government struggled to maintain control. Daniel Ortega and the 9-member National Directory of the Sandinista Front held endless meetings, trying to balance defense, reform, and diplomacy. Cuba and the Soviet Union sent advisors, doctors, and arms, but Nicaragua's resources were stretched thin. Food was scarce, fuel rationed, and inflation spiraled out of control. Still, the revolution tried to hold on to its dream. Land reform continued, redistributing thousands of acres from the wealthy to the poor. Literacy campaigns marched into the countryside with chalk and hope, turning illiterate farmers into readers and thinkers. Women joined militias, radio collectives, and health brigades. To the outside world, it was a bold social experiment. To Washington, it was a red threat expanding across Central America. The war was not only fought with bullets, it was fought with words. U.S. media portrayed the Contras as freedom fighters, brave men standing against a Marxist dictatorship. President Reagan called them the moral equivalent of America's founding fathers. But for the people of Nicaragua, the Contras were often seen as mercenaries, fighters who attacked their own countrymen, destroying villages in the name of saving them. The irony was sharp. The Sandinistas, who had overthrown a U.S.-backed dictator, were now defending themselves from a U.S.-backed rebellion. The revolution had become a mirror of the past, reflecting the same struggle, only this time the faces had changed. Inside the Sandinista ranks, unity began to crack. Some leaders argued that the government was becoming too authoritarian, silencing dissent in the name of security. Others insisted that survival demanded discipline and control. In the midst of these debates, the people, the farmers, workers, and students who had once danced in the streets of victory, found themselves once again caught in the crossfire. Meanwhile, the CIA's operations deepened. Manuals surfaced that advised the Contras on how to neutralize local officials and intimidate civilians. When the International Court of Justice later ruled that the U.S. had violated international law by mining Nicaraguan harbors, Washington simply ignored the verdict. The Sandinistas appealed to the world, gaining sympathy from Europe, the non-aligned movement, and even American peace groups. But sympathy didn't stop the bombs. By 1983, more than 10,000 Nicaraguans had been killed or wounded. Entire villages were displaced, fields went unplanted. Children grew up learning the sound of gunfire before the sound of birds. In those dark years, the dream of 1979 began to blur. What had once been a revolution of poetry and promise was now a revolution of trenches and ration cards. The murals still showed smiling faces and harvests, but behind them lay hunger, fatigue, and quiet doubt. And yet, in the midst of despair, Nicaragua showed extraordinary resilience. Ordinary citizens joined the milicias populares, people's militias, defending their towns with handmade weapons and unwavering faith. Farmers worked by day and guarded by night. Mothers stitched uniforms, wrote letters, and buried their sons with trembling hands and unbroken dignity. International brigades came from abroad, teachers, doctors, priests, and idealists from Europe, Latin America, and even the United States, hoping to support what they saw as a struggle for justice. They brought books, medicine, and solidarity. Their presence reminded Nicaraguans that they were not entirely alone in this storm. Still, the weight of war was relentless. By 1983, the country's economy was collapsing. The U.S. embargo tightened the noose, cutting off vital imports and foreign aid. Electricity blackouts became normal. Fuel shortages paralyzed transportation. And above it all, the question haunted the revolutionaries. Could a small, poor nation survive both internal war and external pressure? Could the dream of justice endure when every sunrise brought more loss? As Daniel Ortega stood before crowds, speaking of dignity and resistance, his voice carried both pride and exhaustion. The crowd cheered, but their eyes told a quieter truth. They were tired of sacrifice, tired of fear, tired of fighting the invisible hand of a distant superpower. The revolution, once so young and fiery,
was learning a hard lesson: that building a new world is harder than destroying the old one.
The war had drained its fields, darkened its cities, and stolen its sons. But it had not stolen its will. Daniel Ortega, once a guerrilla in the mountains, now stood as the public face of the Sandinista Revolution. He spoke with calm conviction of justice, of unity, of peace through strength. To his followers, he was a hero of the people. To his enemies, a dictator in disguise. That year, the Sandinistas made a bold move. They called for national elections, the first in Nicaragua since the fall of Somoza. The goal was simple: to prove to the world that the revolution was not tyranny, but democracy reborn. Opposition parties were invited to participate. Campaign posters appeared on cracked walls beside bullet holes. Rallies filled the plazas. There were songs, speeches, and even debates broadcast on old radios humming across the countryside. But behind the hope, the war still burned. The Contras, now more organized, more funded, and more lethal, intensified their attacks to disrupt the vote. Villages were raided, polling stations destroyed. The United States called the elections a sham, accusing the Sandinistas of controlling the media and silencing dissent. Still, on November 4, 1984, millions of Nicaraguans lined up to vote. Farmers came from distant valleys. Mothers carried babies on their hips. Old men who had once bowed to Somoza's soldiers now stood tall in the morning sun, clutching their ballots like promises. When the results were announced, Daniel Ortega won decisively, over 60% of the vote. International observers, including representatives from Europe and the United Nations, declared the process largely fair. But Washington refused to accept it. The revolution, Ortega declared that night, has been validated not by guns, but by the voice of the people. Fireworks lit up Managua's skyline, but not everyone was celebrating. For the Contras, the election was just another battlefront. And for the United States, it was a signal to double down. In Washington, the Cold War was reaching its fever pitch. Ronald Reagan, now firmly entrenched in his crusade against communism, looked at Nicaragua and saw a dangerous contagion spreading through Latin America. To him, the Sandinistas were not reformers. They were Soviet pawns, a second Cuba in the making. Congress had banned further funding for the Contras under the Boland Amendment, but the White House was not ready to let go. Behind closed doors, a shadow operation began to take shape, a web of secret deals and off-the-record missions that would later explode into the Iran-Contra scandal. Money from illegal arms sales to Iran was quietly diverted to fund the Contras. Weapons were shipped through third countries. Mercenaries trained fighters in the jungles, while U.S. advisors, unofficially, coordinated missions from neighboring Honduras. The war machine turned once more. Contras struck power lines, ambushed convoys, and attacked schools labeled Sandinista indoctrination centers. In response, the Nicaraguan army launched massive counteroffensives, sweeping through forests and hills to crush the insurgency. Civilians, as always, paid the price. Entire families fled their villages, moving from one war zone to another. Hospitals overflowed with wounded children. Priests held funerals under trees because churches had been bombed. In the midst of this chaos, the Sandinistas tightened their grip on power. To protect the revolution, they introduced military conscription, drafting young men to fight in the countryside. It was a decision that divided the nation. For the poor, it was duty. For the weary, it was one more burden. Mothers began to whisper prayers at night, hoping their sons would not be called next. At the same time, the government expanded education, healthcare, and cultural programs, trying to keep the revolutionary flame alive amid the smoke of war. New schools were built. Women's cooperatives expanded.
and art festivals filled Managua with murals and music that sang of resistance. The revolution was bleeding, but still breathing.
By 1985, Nicaragua was living two lives. By day, it was a country of speeches, literacy campaigns, and youthful optimism. By night, it was a country of ambushes, air raids, and whispered fear. In the rural north, villagers built underground shelters. In Managua, ration cards replaced money as inflation devoured wages. Soap, sugar, and even shoes became luxury items. Families bartered beans for medicine, rice for oil. And yet, people still laughed. They sang, danced, and celebrated small victories: a new bridge, a repaired school, a letter from a son at the front. In the poorest neighborhoods, community kitchens fed hundreds daily, run mostly by women. They called it Resistencia Popular, the people's resistance. Still, doubts grew. Was the revolution still theirs, or had it become a party's property? Some Sandinista supporters began questioning the lack of press freedom and the growing presence of the secret police. Newspapers that criticized the government were censored or shut down. Political pluralism, once promised, now seemed conditional. Even among loyal revolutionaries there was unease. "Are we defending socialism?" one worker asked at a meeting, "or just defending power?" In the background, the United States increased its psychological warfare, dropping leaflets, broadcasting anti-Sandinista radio programs from abroad, and painting the government as tyrannical and godless. The propaganda war became as fierce as the one on the ground. But the Sandinistas were not without allies. From Havana to Moscow, support flowed: oil, medical supplies, agricultural machinery. International solidarity brigades from Europe and Latin America arrived, building schools, teaching classes, and harvesting crops. For a brief moment, Nicaragua felt like the center of the world's conscience, a test of whether a small, poor nation could stand against an empire.
By 1986, the cracks beneath the revolution had deepened, but so had its resolve. The war raged on, yet the spirit of unity still burned in unexpected places. Poets and musicians became the voice of endurance. Songs like Nicaragua, Nicaraguita echoed through radio waves, carrying love and longing through the chaos. In murals, the faces of fallen heroes looked down on children learning to read. And in those small acts of persistence, the revolution found its meaning again. Then came a shock that shook not only Managua, but Washington itself: the exposure of the Iran-Contra Affair. In late 1986, journalists revealed that the Reagan administration had secretly sold weapons to Iran, despite an arms embargo, and funneled the proceeds to fund the Contras. The scandal rocked the United States government, leading to congressional hearings, resignations, and public outrage. For Nicaragua, it was vindication, proof that their cries of foreign aggression had not been paranoia, but truth. Daniel Ortega took to the world stage, declaring that the revolution had survived not just bombs, but lies. Still, even vindication could not erase the suffering. By the end of 1986, the war had claimed over 30,000 lives. Entire generations had grown up in conflict, their childhoods marked by sirens and slogans. The revolution was no longer an idea, it was survival. And yet, through all the pain, the people held on. A farmer once told a journalist, "We don't fight for politics. We fight because we want our children to eat." That was the true heartbeat of the revolution. Not ideology, not power, but the stubborn belief that even in darkness, dignity was worth defending. As 1986 came to a close, Nicaragua stood scarred but unbroken. The Sandinistas had faced the might of the United States, the fury of the Contras, and the fatigue of their own people. And still, the flag of red and black flew over Managua. But the cost was enormous. And soon the revolution would have to face its greatest challenge yet. Not war, but peace.
When the guns finally fell silent and the echoes of war drifted away into the humid Nicaraguan air, the people of Nicaragua were left standing amid both victory and ruin. The Sandinista Revolution had triumphed. A dictator had fallen. A people had risen. But the cost had been heavy. Too heavy for many to carry without scars. The streets of Managua still bore the marks of shell fire. Bridges lay in pieces. Families searched for loved ones who never returned. Farmers tried to reclaim their land, planting seeds in soil still laced with fragments of war. Yet through it all, there was something else in the air. A fragile, almost trembling hope. The kind that follows every great struggle. The belief that after pain must come peace, and after destruction, rebirth. The 1980s dawned with cautious optimism. The Sandinista Front, now the ruling government, promised a new beginning. Education campaigns spread through rural villages, teaching adults to read and children to dream. Health brigades crossed rivers and mountains, bringing vaccines and medicine to people long forgotten. Land reform gave peasants ownership for the first time, and murals blossomed on city walls, colorful depictions of martyrs, revolutionaries, and a brighter future. But for all the progress, new challenges emerged not from within Nicaragua's borders, but from beyond them. The Cold War was still raging, and the United States, fearing another Cuba in Central America, could not tolerate a socialist government so close to home. Washington viewed Nicaragua not as a sovereign nation, but as a domino threatening to fall in the wrong direction. Soon, covert funds began to flow once again. Former National Guardsmen, mercenaries, and anti-communist fighters formed a new force, the Contras. Trained, armed, and financed by the CIA, they became a shadow army, slipping across the borders of Honduras and Costa Rica, launching raids and igniting terror in the countryside. The people who had fought for freedom now found themselves defending it all over again. The Sandinista dream of peace was under siege. Villages were burned, bridges destroyed, and civilians caught in the middle. It was a different kind of war, one without clear fronts or uniforms, one that left wounds deeper than bullets could reach. In the midst of this turmoil, the Sandinista leadership faced impossible decisions. How could they protect their revolution while feeding their people? How could they defend themselves without becoming what they once opposed? The need for unity clashed with the pressure of survival. The dream of equality strained under the weight of war, embargoes, and political fatigue. And yet, the Nicaraguan people, resilient as always, continued to endure. Mothers turned grief into activism. Farmers rebuilt. Teachers taught under candlelight. They had known darkness before. They would not let it consume them again. As the decade wore on, the Contras continued their campaign. The war dragged into the late 1980s, leaving tens of thousands dead and an economy in shambles. The U.S. embargo tightened its grip, choking trade and deepening hunger. Nicaragua became a symbol, a small nation caught in the gears of superpower rivalry, paying a price not for its sins but for its independence. By 1990, the country was exhausted. After years of war and deprivation, the people faced a difficult choice. In the first free elections in a decade, they voted for peace, electing opposition leader Violeta Chamorro, ending Sandinista rule for the time being. To some, it was the revolution's defeat. To others, it was its fulfillment, the first peaceful transfer of power in Nicaragua's modern history. The Sandinista Revolution did not end with the fall of Somoza, nor with the victory of the Contras, nor even with an election. It lived on, in the memory of its people, in the murals that still color the walls of León and Esteli, and in the enduring spirit of those who believe that justice and dignity are worth the struggle, no matter how long it takes. When historians look back, they often see revolutions as clear events, a date, a battle, a victory. But in truth, revolutions are rivers, not moments. They twist, they rise, they flood, and sometimes they dry up, but their course shapes everything around them. For Nicaragua, that river still runs. Even today, decades after 1979, the legacy of the Sandinistas continues to divide and define the nation. Some see them as heroes, liberators who gave a voice to the voiceless, who stood up to empire and dared to dream of equality. Others see them as flawed, corrupted by power, their ideals lost in the labyrinth of politics. But one truth remains. The Sandinista Revolution changed Nicaragua forever. It broke the chains of dictatorship and taught its people that power could be challenged. It reminded the world that even the smallest nation could defy the mightiest empire when its people stand together. And beyond the politics, there is something deeper, a lesson that transcends borders. The Sandinista story is a story about resilience, about how faith in a better tomorrow can survive even when the night feels endless, about how courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. The revolution also reminds us of the dangers that come after victory. Power can twist ideals. External forces can corrupt hope, and the dream of freedom must be protected, not just from tyrants, but from complacency and pride. Every generation must renew it, must make it real again. As the narrator of history continues to speak, Nicaragua stands as both a warning and an inspiration, a warning of how easily justice can be undermined when power and ideology collide, and an inspiration, proof that the spirit of a people cannot be silenced forever. Even now, in the markets of Managua and the mountains of Matagalpa, old veterans of the revolution tell their stories to children. They speak not of glory, but of sacrifice, not of hate, but of love. Love for their homeland, for their freedom, for one another. They remind us that revolutions are not about weapons, but about will. And so, the story of the Sandinista Revolution, like the story of all human struggles for justice, ends where it began, with ordinary people daring to believe that they could change the world. The flags may fade, the slogans may lose their echo, but the truth remains timeless, that courage, unity, and compassion can light even the darkest night. The revolution was never just about overthrowing a dictator. It was about proving that a nation, no matter how small, could stand tall. That people, no matter how poor,
could rise together, and that dreams, no matter how fragile, could survive the storm. And as long as there are hearts that refuse to surrender to fear, the spirit of 1979 will live on, not just in Nicaragua, but wherever people rise to reclaim their destiny. Because revolutions, in the end, are not written in history books alone. They are written in the human soul.
The story of the Sandinista Revolution reminds us that freedom is never given, it's earned, and it's protected by those who dare to stand for it. If you've journeyed with us through this chapter of history, remember, every revolution begins with awareness. Every change begins with understanding. Subscribe to our channel to continue exploring the moments that shaped our world, from revolutions and reforms to the untold stories of courage and hope. Join us, learn with us, because history isn't just the past, it's the map to our future.